Many empathetic women quickly sense what others feel. They notice tension in someone's eyes or sadness that has not yet been spoken, and they naturally step into the role of the listener and emotional stabilizer in relationships. Over time, they become used to adjusting themselves to keep others balanced. But from Jung's perspective, when someone lives in this role for too long, the line between their own feelings and those of others begins to blur, and they slowly drift away from their own center. When healing begins, this shift often confuses people around them. The empath no longer reacts to every emotion or feels responsible for fixing everything. This new distance can appear cold, but Jung saw it differently. When a person stops carrying emotions that do not belong to them, the psyche begins to return to its deeper center. And at that moment, a question quietly appears, one that most people around them are not ready to face. What if the distance they fear is actually the moment an empath finally stops losing themselves in other people's lives? Part 1. Why empaths often carry everyone else's emotions. To understand this, we first need to look at how the psychology of an empath is usually formed. In Jung's view, the human psyche functions much like an inner ecosystem. Every part of it needs its own space in order to exist and develop properly. But when a person becomes overly sensitive to the emotions of others, that ecosystem gradually opens itself too widely to the outside world. What belongs to other people begins to seep into their inner life, much like rainwater, slowly soaking into land that has no clear boundaries. At first, this does not seem like a problem. The empath feels that they are doing the right thing. They understand people quickly. They sense what others cannot yet say out loud. And because of that, they often become the person who keeps the emotional atmosphere around them from falling apart. In many groups of friends or within a family, there is almost always someone like this. When tension begins to rise between two people, they are usually the first to feel the heaviness in the air. When someone suddenly becomes unusually quiet, they immediately sense that something unspoken is sitting behind that silence. Over time, they begin to function like an invisible regulator in the emotional life of others. They say the words that calm people down. They adjust the way they speak in order to prevent situations from becoming more tense. They absorb the discomfort of the entire room, much like a sponge placed in the middle of running water. The difficulty is that the human psyche was never designed to function as a sponge forever. Jung suggested that when a person constantly adapts themselves to the demands of the external world, they develop a psychological structure called the persona. The persona is the part of the personality we use to function within society. It works like a protective layer that allows us to step into the world without exposing the entire depth of our inner life. Yet Jung also warned that when a person lives too long inside their persona, they gradually lose sight of what truly belongs to their psyche and what is merely a role they learned in order to survive. Empaths often develop a very particular kind of persona. Their persona becomes the one who stabilizes the emotional environment around them. They become the listener, the mediator, the understanding one in most situations. On the surface, this appears to be a valuable and admirable quality, but at a deeper level of the psyche, a subtle shift begins to take place. Imagine a compass that is constantly placed next to a powerful magnet. The needle of the compass still moves, but it no longer points to true north. It is pulled off course by the magnetic force beside it. The psychology of many empaths works in a similar way. When they continuously orient their behavior around the emotional states of others, their own inner center slowly begins to drift without them realizing it. This helps explain why many empaths eventually experience a strange and difficult-to-name feeling in long-term relationships. They understand other people very clearly, yet they are often unsure whether others truly understand them. They are present in many of other people's stories, but when they turn back toward their own lives, they sometimes feel an unexpected emptiness. That feeling does not appear because they are weak. It appears because their psyche has spent too long facing outward. When a person's psychological energy becomes scattered too far into the outside world, the psyche begins to lose balance between two essential movements: the movement toward the world and the movement back toward the inner center. Once this balance disappears, a person can still continue living, maintaining relationships, and fulfilling responsibilities. But gradually, they begin to feel as if they are living inside a structure that does not entirely belong to them. Imagine someone living in a house where the windows are always open. Outside, air constantly flows into the room. At first, this feels refreshing because the space is always filled with moving air. But if every window remains open and none of them ever close, the house can no longer maintain a stable temperature. Every shift in the weather outside moves directly into the interior. The psyche of an empath often operates in a similar way. They open all the windows of their inner life to the world, yet they rarely learn how to close them when necessary. For this reason, becoming the one who carries everyone's emotions is rarely a conscious decision for an empath. It is the result of many years of psychological adaptation. They learn to sense others before they learn to listen to themselves. They become the stabilizing force for their environment long before they build a stable center within their own inner life. And this is where the story begins to matter. Because when a person has lived for too long like a compass pulled away from its true north, returning to that true direction does not happen gently. It usually begins with a change that the people around them struggle to understand. The empath slowly begins withdrawing their energy from the emotional currents they once absorbed automatically. Yet that is not the most surprising part of this journey. The most surprising part is what an empath begins to see once they stop functioning as a sponge for the emotional life of the entire world. In the next part, we will move closer to what Jung called the psychological mask, and why, for many empaths, that mask has quietly become a prison they have carried for years without realizing it. If you have ever felt that you are always the one responsible for keeping relationships stable, you may want to stay with the next part, because this story may be describing the hidden structure of your own psyche. Part 2. When the empath mask becomes a psychological prison. In Jung's view, the persona is not merely a simple social role. It is more like a bridge built between the inner world and the outer world. Through this bridge, a person can step into society without having to expose the full complexity of their inner life to everyone around them. But a bridge is meant to be crossed, not lived on. When someone begins to stay on that bridge for too long, they slowly lose contact with the land that truly belongs to them. For an empath, that bridge is often built from a very particular material, the ability to understand the emotions of others. From an early age, they learn that sensing what others feel makes relationships easier to navigate. When they listen, tension softens. When they respond with understanding, conflict settles down. Over time, their persona gradually forms around a familiar image, the one who keeps the emotional balance for others. From the outside, this role looks like a strength, but if we examine it more closely in the way Jung often did, it begins to resemble a psychological structure growing in only one direction. Imagine a tree that has been pushed by wind from the same side for many years. At first, the trunk only leans slightly, but if the wind never changes direction, the tree eventually grows into that angle. At a certain point, the leaning is no longer a temporary condition. It becomes the permanent shape of the tree. The persona of an empath often develops in a similar way. They become accustomed to adjusting themselves to match the emotional atmosphere around them. They learn to read the mood of a room before saying anything. They become used to keeping situations from escalating into tension. Over time, they no longer do these things only when necessary. They begin to exist inside that role. Jung once wrote very clearly, "The persona is a complicated system of relations between individual consciousness and society. Fittingly enough, a kind of mask, designed on the one hand to make a definite impression upon others, and on the other, to conceal the true nature of the individual. When the persona grows too strong, it no longer simply helps a person adapt to society. It begins to cover over other parts of the psyche. This becomes especially visible in empaths. Their persona is not built around power or dominance. It is built around being easy to appreciate. The one who understands is seen as a good person. The one who listens is trusted. Because of this, the persona of the empath is rarely questioned. No one asks them to change that role. In fact, people often encourage them to remain exactly as they are. But the human psyche is not designed to live through a single role. Jung saw the psychological life as a system of energy that constantly needs movement and rebalancing. When that energy flows in only one direction for too long, pressure begins to accumulate within the system. A simple image may help here. Imagine a river being forced through a narrow canal. At first, the water continues to move forward without difficulty. But if the entire river must pass through a space that is too small, the pressure of the water gradually builds. Eventually, the current begins to push against the walls of the canal, searching for a wider path. Inside the psyche of an empath, this pressure often builds in very quiet ways. Because their persona is praised by society, they rarely question the role they play. Yet deeper in the psychological structure, a tension begins to form. This is what Jung described as neurotic tension, a condition in which two opposing forces exist at the same time within the psyche. One force wants to maintain the familiar image that others have come to rely on. The other begins to search for a way of living that feels more honest to the self. I once heard the story of a woman named Laura, a human resources manager at a technology company. For many years, Laura was seen by her colleagues as the only person who could handle every conflict inside the office. When two employees clashed, they went to Laura. When someone felt overwhelmed, they went to Laura. She had a remarkable ability to understand people's emotions quickly and always knew what to say to calm a difficult situation. But one day, Laura noticed something that confused her deeply. After a long meeting about internal tensions in the company, she sat alone in her car and felt a very clear emptiness. She was not sad, and she was not angry. She simply felt like a room that had been used all day for other people's conversations. Later, she realized something she had never considered before. The persona of the mediator had grown so large that her own inner life barely had any space left inside her. The image is similar to a house whose living room keeps expanding to welcome more and more guests, while the private rooms at the back slowly shrink. Eventually, the entire house becomes a place for visitors, while the owner no longer has a room that truly belongs to them. When the persona of an empath grows too large, their psyche begins to resemble that kind of structure. They remain trusted by others. Their relationships continue to function. Yet inside the psyche, a subtle sense of confinement begins to appear, not because anyone forced them into that position, but because the image they built for the world now leaves them very little room to live differently. This is the moment when the mask begins to resemble a prison more than a protection. When a person feels that they must continue performing a role even after something inside them has changed, the psyche eventually starts searching for a way to break that structure apart. But when the mask begins to crack, what appears behind it is rarely relief at first. In many cases, the first thing that emerges from the darker regions of the psyche is a part of the self that the empath has spent an entire lifetime trying not to see. Part 3. The moment the mind is forced to find another path. This often happens very quietly. There is no dramatic event that announces it in advance. One day, the empath simply begins to notice that situations which once felt normal now feel heavier than before. A long conversation about someone else's problems is no longer just a conversation. It begins to feel like a stream of water pouring directly into the mind. Even after the conversation ends, the feeling remains. Many empaths describe this experience as walking out of a crowded room, but still carrying the noise inside their head. The body has left the situation, but the psyche has not. In Jungian psychology, this is the moment when the inner system begins to react to an imbalance that has lasted for too long. Jung saw the psyche as a system of energy that constantly tries to maintain equilibrium. When one part of the system is overused, the rest of the system begins to generate pressure in order to correct it. For empaths, psychological energy is often drawn too strongly toward the outside world. They observe, they sense, and they adjust themselves to match the emotional state of others. Over many years, this process becomes so natural that they rarely notice how much of their inner energy is being spent. Imagine a house where every window is permanently open. Wind, sound, and temperature from the outside can enter very easily. At first, this feels refreshing and spacious. But if there is no door that can be closed, the house slowly loses its ability to maintain its own temperature. Every change in the weather outside flows directly inside. The psyche of an empath often resembles that house. The windows are open wide to the world, yet no one ever taught them how to close the windows when necessary. When this imbalance continues for too long, the psyche begins to place the person in a state of inner tension. Jung described this tension as the opposition of psychological forces. One part of the person wants to continue living within the familiar structure. The empath still wants to understand others and maintain harmony in relationships. But another part of the psyche begins to resist. This part no longer wants to absorb every surrounding emotion. These two movements pull in opposite directions and create a feeling that is difficult to name. Many empaths in this stage begin to believe that they have changed in a negative way. They feel colder, less patient, and sometimes even avoid conversations that once felt natural to them. But Jung viewed this phenomenon from a deeper perspective. He believed that when two psychological opposites become too tense, the psyche has the capacity to create a new form of awareness that rises above both. Jung once wrote, "The psychological rule says that when an inner situation is not made conscious, it appears outside as fate. This means that when a person does not recognize the imbalance within their inner life, they will continue to repeat situations that exhaust them. But once awareness begins to appear, the psyche gains the possibility of forming a new structure." I can illustrate this through the story of Olivia, a woman who works in the healthcare field. Olivia has always been trusted by both patients and colleagues because she listens with remarkable depth. For years, she considered this ability her greatest strength. But one evening after a long shift, Olivia sat by the emergency exit and realized that she felt nothing at all. She was not sad and not angry. There was simply a very clear emptiness. She later described it as a glass that had been filled for too long until there was no space left for anything else. The problem was not that she had felt too much. The problem was that she had never placed a boundary between her own emotions and the emotions of others. The moment of realizing this is often like seeing the outline of oneself for the first time. Before that, everything feels like a single body of water. Afterward, the psyche begins to draw a new boundary. This is the point where a different possibility begins to form. In Jungian terms, this process is called the transcendent function. It is the psyche's capacity to create a new state that goes beyond two opposing extremes. For an empath, this means they do not have to choose between two rigid options. They do not have to continue absorbing every surrounding emotion, but they also do not have to shut themselves off from the world. A simple way to picture this is the difference between a sponge and a riverbank. A sponge absorbs whatever touches it. A riverbank allows the water to pass while remaining solid in its own place. As the psyche of the empath develops boundaries, they gradually move from the state of a sponge to the state of a riverbank. This change does not remove their capacity for empathy. In fact, it stabilizes it. They can still sense another person's sadness, but that sadness no longer occupies the entire space inside them. They can understand a difficult story without carrying it with them for the rest of the day. The moment when the mind recognizes this shift is usually very quiet, but it marks a profound change in the structure of the psyche. From this point forward, the empath slowly begins to step out of the role they have lived in for so long. What is interesting is that when this change begins, their behavior may look very different from the outside. They respond more slowly than before. They no longer rush to solve every emotional problem in their relationships. A subtle distance begins to appear between them and the emotional currents around them. Many people see this change and assume the empath has become cold. But in Jungian psychology, this distance has a completely different meaning. It is often the first sign that the psyche has begun to return to its own center. In the next part, we will move into a deeper layer of this journey. This is where the empath must confront the part of the psyche that Jung called the shadow, because the process of real healing does not begin until this darker side becomes visible. But before we continue, if you have ever experienced the moment when you realized you could no longer carry everyone else's emotions the way you once did, feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. Sometimes speaking aloud what you have carried inside for too long is already the first step in allowing the psyche to change. Part 4. The shadow empaths were taught to hide. When Jung spoke about the shadow, he was not referring to a dark part of the human being in a moral sense, nor to something evil that must be removed. He was referring to the parts of ourselves that were pushed out of the light of consciousness because they did not fit the image we learned to maintain in front of the world. The human psyche is not only what we consciously claim to be, it also contains everything we once had to restrain in order to remain accepted. The shadow is where those rejected parts continue to live. It is like the basement of an old house. On the ground floor, the house may look orderly, bright, and carefully arranged in a way that makes visitors feel comfortable. Yet beneath it, in the basement, there are still objects that once had meaning. They were simply moved downstairs because they no longer fit the order of the rooms above. For an empath, That basement often contains emotions they were taught should not exist within them. Over many years, they learn to become the understanding one, the gentle one, the person who can feel the pain of others without resisting it. But the psyche is not a painting made with a single color. Within the natural structure of a human being, there are also stronger emotions. Anger when a boundary has been crossed, discomfort when one is asked to endure something unfair, the need to be prioritized, and the need to say that one no longer has the energy to continue. These emotions are not signs of cruelty. They are natural responses of the psyche when its limits are touched. The difficulty is that in the lives of many empaths, these responses do not seem to belong to the identity they have built for themselves. When a person is repeatedly praised for their gentleness and understanding, they begin to believe that this is the entirety of who they are. Any emotion that does not match that image is gradually pushed out of conscious awareness. Those feelings do not disappear, but they are kept in a place the person no longer looks at. Jung expressed this very clearly. Everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is. What is pushed into darkness does not cease to exist. It only changes the way it appears. In the life of an empath, this often shows up as confusing repetitions in relationships. They may notice that they continually find themselves in situations where they must give more than they can realistically sustain. They meet people who need to be rescued, who need to be listened to, who need emotional stability. At first, they enter these relationships with sincerity, but over time, a deeper exhaustion begins to appear, one they cannot easily explain. This dynamic resembles a house with a room that has been locked for too long. The owner may continue living normally in the other rooms, but sometimes sounds from the locked room still echo through the house. The empath's shadow functions in a similar way. When the need to protect oneself, to say no, or to set boundaries is pushed out of awareness, the psyche will eventually bring it back through repeated situations, not to punish the person, but to force them to see what they have avoided seeing for too long. A woman named Daniela once described such an experience during a discussion group focused on Jungian psychology. Daniela worked in community care and was widely known as someone who was always willing to help. For many years, she was the person others turned to in moments of crisis. Yet she noticed that after these periods, she often felt quietly exhausted and strangely irritated. She never spoke about it because she believed that a true empath should not react that way. Only after she began reading Jung did she understand what was happening. The irritation was not a sign that she had lost compassion. It was the voice of a part of her psyche trying to say that her boundaries had been crossed for far too long. When an empath begins to look at these emotions in this way, something important shifts within the structure of the psyche. Feelings that once seemed unacceptable begin to be understood as signals. Anger no longer appears as something shameful. It becomes information indicating that a personal limit has been touched. Fatigue no longer looks like weakness. It becomes a reminder that inner energy must also be protected. The simplest image for this process is a change in the way a person relates to darkness. When a room has no light, the darkness inside it can lead the mind to imagine many frightening things. But once the light is turned on, one often discovers that the room only contains familiar objects that were forgotten. The empath's shadow is similar. When the light of awareness begins to enter it, the parts that once seemed threatening reveal themselves as natural elements of the psyche. This process does not turn an empath into a cold person. On the contrary, It makes the psychological structure more complete. Before, they were living from only one side of themselves, the side that always understands and gives. When the shadow is integrated, they begin to live from a wider structure where compassion and boundaries can exist together. At this point, something very interesting begins to appear in the way an empath relates to the world. They can still feel the pain of others, but they no longer feel that they must carry that pain inside themselves. They can still listen, yet they no longer lose their center in the process. From the outside, however, this change is often misunderstood. Others may say that they have become more distant, that they no longer react the way they once did, that they seem to hold a new kind of distance in their relationships. But from Jung's perspective, that distance is not coldness. It is a sign that the psyche has finally begun to stand on its own foundation. In the next part, we will move deeper into a very important moment in this journey, the point at which an empath no longer needs the approval of others to know their own value. And it is precisely at that moment that what Jung called the completion of the self begins to appear more clearly. Part 5. When empaths no longer seek external validation. For much of an empath's life, the sense of personal worth is rarely formed in the quiet interior space of the psyche. Instead, it takes shape through small responses from the outside world. When they help someone calm down, when they keep a conversation from turning into conflict, when someone says, "You're the only one who really understands me," those moments act like brief flashes of light entering the psyche. Each small flash creates the feeling that they are standing in the right place in the world. But if we look more closely, this is a fragile psychological structure. The source of that light always comes from the outside. It is like a lamp placed in someone else's yard, while the room inside one's own house has not yet truly been illuminated. From Jung's perspective, this state reflects a stage in which the ego still defines itself through the roles given by the surrounding environment. The psyche at that point resembles a mirror that constantly faces outward, reflecting what the world wants to see. This helps a person function in society, but it also causes them to gradually forget a more fundamental question: who am I when I am no longer standing inside those roles? For an empath, this question is particularly difficult to face because for many years they have been recognized as the one who stabilizes the emotional atmosphere of others. That role brings recognition, but it also creates a subtle dependence on external validation. Jung once expressed this process in a striking way. Who looks outside dreams. Who looks inside awakes. When someone becomes too accustomed to looking outward in order to know who they are, they live like a person dreaming in a world of reflections. Everything appears clear while there is light coming from outside. But when those responses begin to fade, an unexplained sense of emptiness can appear. This is why many empaths experience a strange period when they begin withdrawing their energy from draining relationships. They no longer receive the familiar signals that they are useful. No one constantly needs them to interpret their emotions. There are no longer conversations that stretch for hours just to hear someone say that their presence makes things easier to bear. And when those signals quiet down, a certain emptiness begins to reveal itself. This emptiness often makes people uneasy. Yet in Jungian language, it is a sign that a deep restructuring has begun. The psyche resembles an ecosystem that needs a stable center around which the rest can organize itself. If that center lies in the responses of the outside world, the system must constantly adjust itself to the environment. But when the process of individuation begins, the center of that system gradually moves inward. This shift does not happen through a sudden decision. It is more like a planet slowly leaving the gravitational pull of an old orbit and entering a wider one. At this stage, the empath begins to recognize that their capacity to feel deeply does not have to be tied to self-sacrifice. In the past, they may have believed that if they truly cared about others, they always had to be available, always had to listen, always had to prevent things from falling apart. But as the center of the psyche shifts, another realization appears. Empathy is not the act of dissolving oneself into another person's emotions. It is more like standing on the bank of a large river. You can see the current, you can understand its force, but you do not need to step into the water to prove that you understand it. This shift often changes how the empath appears in relationships. They no longer react immediately to every emotional movement around them. They no longer try to repair everything that begins to tilt in a conversation. This does not happen because they have lost their sensitivity, but because they begin to understand that not every movement in the world needs to pass through their center. Their psyche begins to function more like a stable axis. What happens around them can still be felt, but it no longer pulls the entire psychological structure away from its place. The closest image for this state is the difference between a leaf drifting along a current and a tree rooted deeply in the ground. The leaf responds to every movement of the water. The tree still feels the wind and the change of seasons, yet it is not carried away by them. When the empath begins to live from the center of the self, they gradually become that tree. They remain sensitive to what happens around them, but their stability no longer depends on the reactions of the environment. Within Jung's psychological framework, this is a clear sign that individuation is deepening. The ego is no longer the sole center directing psychic life. A broader order begins to emerge, in which different parts of the psyche find their proper balance. For the empath, this does not mean their capacity for empathy disappears. It simply means that empathy is no longer the only measure of their value. And at this point, a paradox begins to appear. When empaths no longer need validation from others to know they have value, the way they appear in the world often becomes quieter, less reactive, and marked by a distance that did not exist before. Many people see that distance and assume they have become cold. But from Jung's perspective, what is appearing is not coldness. It is the sign that the psyche has finally found its center. Part 6. The moment an empath begins to set inner boundaries. When this center begins to stabilize, a very subtle yet profound shift takes place in how an empath experiences the emotional life around them. In the past, they were like a piece of land without fences. Every current of feeling from the environment could pour into it. Other people's joy entered, other people's sorrow entered, and other people's anxiety entered as well. Over time, that land could no longer distinguish between the rain falling from the sky and the floodwater rushing in from the surrounding rivers. The psyche of the empath therefore began to resemble a plain that was constantly submerged. The soil remained fertile, but everything within it was always being pulled along by currents that did not truly belong to it. The real moment of healing begins when the empath realizes that their ability to feel deeply is not the problem. The real issue is that they were never taught how to recognize the boundary of their own inner ground. In Jungian psychology, this shift is closely connected to the development of conscious inner observation. When awareness turns inward instead of constantly moving outward, a person begins to notice the subtle movements of the psyche. They begin to see that an emotion appearing within them is not necessarily their own, Sometimes it is simply a wave passing through. When an empath cannot yet distinguish between their own emotions and those of the environment, they often come to believe that being pulled into other people's feelings is simply their destiny. But when awareness begins to illuminate the inner landscape, a new possibility appears. They can observe an emotion without immediately becoming part of it. This state is similar to standing on the bank of a river rather than swimming inside it. When someone is in the water, every current pulls the body along. But when standing on the shore, the power of the current can still be seen and heard without being carried away by it. As an empath begins to develop boundaries, the psyche undergoes a similar transformation. They can still sense the emotional movements around them, but their center no longer lies within that current. This process often begins with very small changes in everyday life. The empath starts to realize that they can pause before reacting. When someone brings a heavy emotional story, they no longer immediately carry it on their shoulders. They listen, but at the same time, they observe their own response. Is the body tightening or remaining open? Is the mind being pulled fully into the story, or is there still a quiet space of distance? These moments of observation become the first lines drawn on the inner map of the psyche. At the same time, emotions that were suppressed for many years begin to appear more clearly. Anger, disappointment, or simply the feeling of no longer wanting to endure a certain situation. In the past, empaths often push these feelings down quickly because they did not fit the image of the understanding person they had learned to embody. But as the process of individuation deepens, they begin to see these emotions differently. These feelings are not enemies of compassion. They function more like warning signals from the inner system, indicating that the boundaries of the psyche have been crossed. In symbolic terms, anger in this context resembles the root system of a tree. Most people notice the trunk and the branches because they are visible above the ground, but it is the roots that hold the tree steady against the wind. When the empath allows these stronger emotions to exist consciously, they are allowing the roots of the psyche to grow deeper. And when the roots are deep enough, the trunk is no longer shaken by every passing wind. Over time, these small boundaries in daily life begin to form a more stable structure. An empath may leave a conversation when they feel their energy is depleted without feeling the need to explain themselves extensively. They may say they need time alone without carrying guilt. They may listen to someone's pain without automatically taking responsibility for solving it. From the outside, these actions may appear simple, but within the psyche, they mark a profound shift. This shift is similar to a city finally building its own walls. The gates remain open for merchants and travelers to pass through, but no army can storm the city without being recognized. As the empath develops boundaries, the psyche becomes like that city. It does not close itself to the world, but it no longer allows the world to occupy all of its inner space. And as this state gradually stabilizes, what many people call detachment begins to appear naturally. This is not a separation born from disappointment or emotional injury. It is the result of a mature psychological structure. The empath still feels deeply, but they no longer dissolve into every emotional current around them. They become like a lighthouse, standing firmly on a rocky shore. Its light still reaches far across the sea, but the tower itself is not carried away by the waves. In Jung's view, this is a clear sign that the process of individuation has reached an important stage. A person is no longer living entirely from the unconscious reactions of the environment. They begin to live from a deeper center where the different parts of the psyche find their balance. And when an empath stands firmly in that center, Detachment is no longer something frightening. It becomes clear proof that they have learned how to live in the world without losing themselves. When an empath finally learns how to keep their emotional energy for themselves, it does not mean they have become cold or distant from people. It simply shows that they have understood a very important principle of inner life. A sensitive heart can continue to love only when it no longer has to carry the emotional weight of the entire world. The detachment that many people notice at this stage is actually a sign that the psyche has found a new balance, a place where empathy and self-protection can exist together without canceling each other out. And as Jung once suggested, the greatest privilege of a lifetime is not becoming what others expect you to be, but becoming who you truly are once all the masks have finally been set down. If the reflections in this video resonate with something you have experienced in your own life, you can leave a like to help this message reach others who are also trying to understand themselves more deeply. And if you would like to keep exploring the depths of the mind through Jung's perspective, you can subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the upcoming videos.